I still remember the night he walked in with that suitcase, his eyes cold, his mouth twisted in a way I had never seen before, and then he spat the words that cut deeper than any knife. I refuse to be tied to a lazy, worthless woman. Can you imagine hearing that from the man you built your life around? The one you cooked for, cleaned for, stood beside through every storm. He thought he had broken me right there, but what he never knew, what he could never imagine, was that behind my silence I carried a secret that would one day leave him speechless. Thank you so much for watching and staying with me. It means more than I can put into words. And before I go further, I would truly love to know where you are watching from. So please tell me down in the comments, because hearing your voices makes me feel less alone as I share these memories. You see, when he hurled those cruel words at me and slammed that door, I felt like the floor had disappeared beneath my feet. But instead of collapsing, I sat there in the quiet and let the weight of it sink into my bones. For years I had been the woman who kept everything together, who smiled when it hurt, who swallowed her pride just to keep peace at the table. And now I was being cast aside, as though all of it meant nothing at all. Still, even through the ache, I told myself that pain has its way of teaching us, and I promised that one day he would come to understand the worth of what he had thrown away, though not in the way he expected. I was born in a small town where people believed that a woman's worth was measured by how well she cared for her family. And that belief sank deep into me as a young girl. So when I married him, I thought my purpose was to pour myself into his life and his dreams. I gave up chances to build a career of my own. I stayed home to keep the house in order. I made sure dinner was warm, no matter how late he came in. And when he complained about being tired or stressed, I would sit quietly, nodding and telling him tomorrow would be better. For many years I believed that was love, that sacrifice was proof of loyalty. And I told myself that one day he would look back and see how much I had done. But as time passed, the respect slowly drained away. He began to sigh when I spoke, roll his eyes at my suggestions, and sometimes in front of others he would make little jokes about how I never worked a real job or how I would be lost without him. I would laugh it off, trying not to make a scene. But deep inside I felt those tiny stings, little cuts that were easy to ignore one by one, but together began to bleed me dry. Still, I told myself patience was strength, that good wives endured, and I pushed on, even inviting my closest friend Lisa into our lives, because I trusted her like a sister. She would stop by often, sharing coffee with me at the kitchen table, listening to me speak about my worries. And she always seemed so supportive, so encouraging, that I never once suspected her smile carried something else beneath it. Looking back now, I can see the signs I chose to ignore. The way her laughter was a little brighter when he entered the room. The way his stories grew longer when she was listening. And the way their eyes sometimes met in a silence that I convinced myself meant nothing. I thought Lisa was safe. I thought she cared about me. And I thought he still respected the vows we had taken. But betrayal does not shout. It whispers in small moments until one day it roars in your face. And when he finally spoke those words, calling me worthless, I realized all those little moments had been stepping stones leading to that night. Yet even then, he did not know the truth about me. The truth about what I had been building quietly. While he dismissed me, the night everything truly broke apart is carved into my memory, like it happened only yesterday. Because he did not come home the way a husband comes home, with a greeting or a question about dinner. He came home carrying a suitcase in his hand and a look on his face that told me whatever words were coming next would change my life forever. I was sitting at the table, a cup of tea growing cold beside me, when he dropped that suitcase near the door, and without even taking off his coat, he spoke with a tone I had never heard from him before. Sharp and almost rehearsed. And he said, "I want a divorce. I'm tired of carrying dead weight. You've done nothing with your life, and I refuse to be tied to a lazy, worthless woman." The words hit me like a slap, echoing inside me, making the room spin as if every year of sacrifice, every meal cooked, every night I stayed up waiting for him, had just been swept away with a single cruel sentence. I looked at him, my hands trembling against the table, and I searched for some sign that he was joking, that he had let anger carry him too far. But instead he stared back at me with cold determination. And then, as if the knife he had driven into me wasn't deep enough, he twisted it by saying he was leaving me for someone else. And when I asked who, when I forced the words through the lump in my throat, he smiled almost with relief, and he said her name. Lisa. My closest friend, my confidant. The woman who had sat in my kitchen sipping coffee while I poured out my worries, the woman who I thought would always stand beside me, had been standing beside him instead. It was not just betrayal, it was humiliation, because I suddenly saw every shared laugh, every whispered conversation, every glance across the room with new eyes, and the pieces of their deceit clicked together until I realized how blind I had been. I could not speak, I could not cry. I could only sit there listening to him praise her, saying she had ambition, saying she got him in a way I never did, as if the years of loyalty, the years of keeping his home and holding his secrets and lifting his spirits when he was down, meant nothing at all. My body felt heavy, as though chains had been draped across my shoulders, but inside something small and steady began to stir. Because even as he declared my life meaningless, I remembered what he did not know, what he had never cared to ask, that while he had been belittling me, I had been building something he could never touch. And so I said nothing. I let him believe he had the final word. I let him carry his suitcase out the door, with the confidence of a man convinced he had won, but deep down I knew the story was far from finished. Because my silence was not weakness, it was preparation. And one day he would learn the price of underestimating me. When the door closed behind him that night, the silence in the house felt heavier than the sound of his footsteps, and for a long moment I just sat there staring at the empty chair across from me, the one where he had eaten every dinner I cooked, the one where he had leaned back with satisfaction when things were going his way, and it struck me that it was no longer mine to set for him, no longer mine to keep warm. I should have cried right then. I should have fallen to pieces on the floor, but instead I felt a strange calm wash over me, as if my body finally understood that the storm I had been bracing for had already hit, and I had survived the first wave. The betrayal cut deep, deeper than I thought I could ever endure. Not only because my husband had walked out, but because Lisa's name echoed in my ears. Lisa, who had been the one I called when I felt lonely. Lisa, who I trusted to guard my secrets. Lisa, who I thought understood what loyalty meant. And yet, she had been stealing pieces of my life behind my back until she finally took the part of it I thought could never be taken. Lying in bed that night, I could not close my eyes. Every time I tried, I saw his suitcase by the door. I saw his sneer. I heard the words worthless over and over until they felt tattooed into my skin. And for a moment I asked myself if maybe he was right. If maybe my life had amounted to nothing more than waiting on someone who never saw me as equal. The weight of all those years pressed down on me, and I thought of the countless sacrifices, the opportunities I let slip away, the moments I kept quiet just to avoid arguments, and it all seemed wasted now that he had tossed me aside like I was nothing more than a burden he had carried too long. But as the hours stretched on, and the first light of morning touched the window, I remembered something that pulled me back from despair. I remembered that I had not been idle, I had not been dependent, and though he never cared enough to notice, I had built a life for myself beyond the walls of our marriage. For 7 long years I had been working in silence, consulting remotely for 3 companies, managing projects late at night after he had gone to sleep, sending invoices, building trust, and saving every penny in a private account he knew nothing about. $450,000 sat quietly waiting, a secret shield I had forged out of patience and persistence. And in that moment, as I lay alone in the bed we once shared, I realized that I was not broken, I was not powerless, and I was certainly not worthless. And beyond that, there was still my grandmother's inheritance, untouched and waiting, a reminder that I came from a line of women who endured, who carried their dignity no matter how cruel life became. He thought I had nothing. He thought he was walking into a brighter future with Lisa. But the truth was, he had left behind the very foundation he had been standing on all along, and soon enough, he would see it with his own eyes. In the days that followed, I moved through the house like a shadow, every corner reminding me of the years I had poured into that marriage. Yet instead of drowning in grief, I found myself growing steadier with each passing sunrise. Because while he thought he had taken everything from me, the truth was he had no idea what I still held close. I gathered my records, opened the folders he had never bothered to ask about. And there it was, page after page of invoices, contracts, and payment receipts that told the story of the work I had quietly done while he dismissed me as idle. The total sat there on the screen, $450,000. Earned not through handouts or luck, but through nights of dedication, mornings of discipline, and years of biting my tongue whenever he mocked me for doing nothing. Seeing that number gave me a strength I cannot quite describe, because it was not only money, it was proof that I had value all along, proof that I had been far more than the image he painted of me. I thought about Lisa then, about how she must have listened to me over coffee, nodding at my worries, pretending to sympathize, while secretly weaving her way into his arms, and I wondered if she believed his lies too. If she thought I had wasted my life, if she thought she was stepping into wealth and comfort, built only by him. They both believed the story he told, that he was the provider and I was the dependent, and that blindness gave me the greatest advantage of all. They thought they were stepping over a broken woman, but in truth, they had just walked away from the one holding all the cards. I remembered my grandmother's inheritance as well, untouched and still mine. Another layer of security that neither of them even imagined existed, and I realized then that the chains I thought were wrapped around me had already been broken. I was free long before he said the word divorce. When the papers arrived, I signed them with a steady hand. No tears, no pleading, just a quiet smile as I wished him luck. Every stroke of the pen felt like drawing a line between the woman I had been and the woman I was becoming. And when the envelope was sealed and sent back, I sat at the table, no longer shaking, but breathing easier than I had in years. He believed he had won, that he had rid himself of a burden and secured a brighter future with Lisa. But what he did not know was that his victory was nothing more than an illusion. Because while he stepped forward with arrogance, I stood still with certainty, and sooner than he expected, he would learn that the one he had underestimated was the one who had built the life he thought belonged to him. After the divorce papers were signed and sent away, the house fell into a silence I had never known. A silence that no longer felt suffocating, but strangely comforting, because for the first time in years, I was not waiting for the sound of his key in the door, not bracing myself for the sighs, the criticism, or the dismissive glances that had become so common. I began to reclaim the space one small step at a time, moving his forgotten shirts out of the closet, folding them neatly into boxes, and with every drawer I emptied, I felt lighter, as if the weight he had pressed on me for so long was slowly lifting. Yet while my hands were busy with these small acts of closure, my mind was clear on a much bigger plan. For I knew the moment he walked away with Lisa on his arm, he believed he had stepped into a life of security and ease, never realizing that the foundation of all he enjoyed had never come from him at all. I took long evenings at the dining table, spreading out the documents that proved my independence, not to boast, not even to count the money again, but to remind myself that I had built something strong and untouchable. $450,000 in a private account, carefully managed, patiently grown, and it was mine alone. He had always prided himself on being the clever one, the successful one, the man others admired, but he never looked closely at the life we shared, never noticed the way bills were paid on time, vacations quietly covered, and small luxuries supplied without question. He thought it was all his doing, yet it had been me, year after year, ensuring that we lived comfortably while he took the credit. And now, as he basked in the glow of a new marriage to Lisa, I let him keep that illusion, because I knew illusions cannot stand forever. There was also the inheritance from my grandmother, tucked safely away, untouched and waiting. Another reminder of the strength of the women who came before me. Women who knew the value of patience, dignity, and quiet power. I thought of her often during those days, her gentle voice reminding me that storms pass, that betrayal carries its own punishment, and that true strength does not always need to roar. With that wisdom echoing in my heart, I made a decision not to chase after him, not to expose Lisa immediately, not to shout the truth from the rooftops. Instead, I would wait, calm and steady, knowing that the time would come when he would see what he had thrown away. And when that moment arrived, the look on his face would be worth more than any words I could ever speak. So I moved carefully, preparing without letting anyone see, securing my accounts, making sure every detail of my finances was in order, and keeping my expression neutral whenever neighbors mentioned how happy he looked with Lisa. They thought I was broken. They thought I had been left with nothing. But inside, I carried a quiet fire, one fueled not by bitterness, but by the certainty that justice has its own rhythm, and mine was already on its way. It was not long before I heard the whispers about their wedding, how quickly he and Lisa moved to tie themselves together, how proud he looked standing beside her, as though he had finally found what he deserved, and how she smiled in that way people do when they believe they have won. I did not cry when I heard the news. I did not feel the urge to interrupt or confront them. Instead, I let the silence wrap around me like a cloak, and reminded myself that appearances are fragile, that joy built on betrayal has cracks too deep to hold. On the day they stood before their guests, I did not make a scene. I did not beg for attention or cling to the past. I chose instead to sit quietly in the back, almost invisible, watching them bask in the glow of what they thought was triumph. I remember the way people looked at me with pity, whispering behind their hands, assuming I was a broken woman, forced to witness her husband marry her closest friend. And perhaps in their eyes I seemed weak. But in my heart I carried a calmness they could never understand. I had no need to shout or expose them, no need to reveal the truth of who had really carried the weight of that old marriage, because I knew what they did not, that the future they were so eager to build together stood on sand, and soon the tide would wash it all away. The music played, the vows were spoken, their hands intertwined as if to mock the loyalty I had given for years. But while they smiled for the cameras and accepted the congratulations of others, I sat there with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the game was not over. The memory of Lisa sipping coffee in my kitchen, leaning in close as I shared my worries, replayed in my mind as I watched her kiss the man who had once sworn to honor me, and for a fleeting moment anger threatened to rise, but I pushed it down, because anger was what they expected, and anger would give them the power to paint me as bitter and jealous. Instead, I held on to dignity, and dignity is heavier than rage. It stays when all else fades, and I let it sit with me like an anchor, keeping me steady while they drifted on illusions. I did not look away. I did not leave early. I watched every step, every promise, every toast, not because I longed for him, but because I wanted to remember exactly what betrayal looks like when it dresses itself in lace and smiles. When the ceremony ended and the crowd gathered around them, I slipped out unnoticed, my footsteps soft against the floor, my heart strangely light. Because I knew the best revenge was already in motion. Not by my hand, but by the truth that was waiting just around the corner. They believed they had taken everything from me. But what they did not know was that I still held everything that mattered. And the day was coming when the world, and most of all he, would finally see who was truly worthless and who had been carrying the weight all along. It was only a few weeks after their wedding when the letter arrived, the kind of envelope that feels heavier than its weight, the kind that carries news capable of changing everything. And as I held it in my hands, I thought of my grandmother, of the strength she had given me, and of the inheritance she had left behind as both a gift and a reminder of where I came from. I opened it slowly, the paper crisp under my fingers, and when my eyes moved across the words, I felt a wave of emotion swell inside me, because at that moment it became official. The inheritance was mine in full, untouched, waiting to be claimed. It was not only money, it was history. It was sacrifice passed down through generations. It was a message that though others may try to break me, my roots ran too deep to be pulled from the ground. I sat at the table with that letter before me, sunlight spilling across the wood, and for the first time in a long while, I felt tears rise not from sorrow but from relief, because this was more than security. It was proof that I had not been abandoned by life itself. $450,000 I had already earned stood quietly in one account, and now this inheritance, layered upon it, became a fortress no betrayal could breach. And while he and Lisa smiled for photographs, sipping wine in their new home, I sat in the same house he had once mocked me in, and realized that I was richer in ways he had never been. Not only in money, but in peace, because my dignity was still intact. And his was gone the moment he chose betrayal. I could picture the day he would discover it, the day he would finally realize that the woman he had called worthless was the one who held more than he could ever dream. And though I did not plan to flaunt it, I knew the truth would reach him, because truths like these have a way of finding their audience. I imagined the shock on his face, the tightening of his jaw, the sudden realization that the comfort he thought Lisa would provide had already been resting in my hands all along. And the image brought me a quiet satisfaction that no public confrontation could ever match. It was not about revenge in fire or fury. It was about justice written in silence. Justice that does not need to shout because it knows it has already won. As I folded the letter back into its envelope and placed it neatly with my other papers, I whispered a thank you to my grandmother, because her gift was not just the inheritance. It was the lesson that patience carries its own reward. And with that knowledge, I stood from the table lighter, calmer, ready to face whatever whispers or rumors might come, because I no longer needed to prove my worth to anyone. He had chosen his path, Lisa had chosen hers, and I had chosen mine, and mine was paved with dignity, strength, and a fortune that they could never touch. It was not long after the inheritance was settled that word reached him, and though I had not gone out of my way to share the news, life has a way of carrying truth straight to those who need to hear it most. And soon enough, he discovered what I had kept hidden all those years. I still remember the day he came to see me, his voice colder than before, but laced now with something new, something he could not hide no matter how he tried to dress it with anger. It was fear and regret. He asked me directly, almost spitting the words, if it was true that I had been working behind his back, if it was true that I had money he had never seen, and if it was true that my grandmother's inheritance had finally come into my hands. I did not raise my voice, I did not argue. I simply looked him in the eye and told him the truth, that every cent was mine. Earned with quiet labor, saved with patience, and passed down with love from the woman who had raised me to endure. For a moment he said nothing, but I could see it written across his face, the shock that twisted his mouth, the bitterness in his eyes, the disbelief that the woman he had called worthless was the one who had carried him all along. He tried to mask it with arrogance, saying Lisa was all he needed, that money did not matter, but I could see through him. I could see the calculations racing through his mind, the dawning horror as he realized he had left behind the very foundation of his comfort. That look alone was worth every sleepless night I had endured, every insult I had swallowed, because nothing I could ever say would pierce him as deeply as the realization that his betrayal had cost him everything he thought was his. I sat there calmly while he shifted in his chair, his anger building not because I had wronged him, but because he knew he had wronged himself. And in that moment, I learned something powerful. That revenge does not always come in loud declarations or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it comes in the quiet certainty of knowing that the truth will always rise. He tried to belittle me once more, saying that I had tricked him, that I had been dishonest. But I let him speak, and when his words finally ran out, I told him simply that I owed him nothing, not an explanation, not a dollar, not even my anger, because he had forfeited all of that the moment he chose Lisa. The silence after that was heavier than any argument we had ever had, because he understood at last that his chapter in my life was closed, and nothing he said could reopen it. When he left that day, I watched him walk away, his shoulders stiff, his steps quick, and I knew that whatever mask he wore in front of Lisa would eventually crack, because she would see the regret in his eyes, the bitterness that no amount of false ambition could cover. And she would learn soon enough that the life they had built on betrayal was nothing but a hollow shell. And I, standing alone yet stronger than I had ever been, felt peace settle over me like a soft blanket. Because I no longer needed to prove myself. I had already won the only battle that mattered, the battle of knowing my worth when others had called me worthless. After that meeting, I felt something inside me shift. Because for the first time in so many years, I was not defined by his words, his moods, or his approval. I was simply myself, and that was enough. The house that once felt like a prison began to feel like my own again. Every room no longer echoing with his dismissive remarks, but with the quiet sound of my steps, steady and sure. I redecorated small things at first, moving a chair, changing curtains, placing flowers on the table where once his complaints had sat, and with each change I felt the weight of him fade further into the past. There was a peace in walking through those rooms and knowing that everything there reflected me, my choices, my patience, my strength, and not his endless demands. I found joy in the simple rhythms of my days, sitting by the window in the morning with my coffee, reading books I had never had time for, tending to the garden without rushing back inside to cook meals that would only be criticized, and discovering hobbies I had long forgotten I loved. It was as if life had been on pause and suddenly it began again, quietly but fully, and every moment tasted sweeter, because I had survived the bitterness that came before. Neighbors would stop by and comment on how well I looked, how calm I seemed, and though they never knew the full story, I could feel the respect in their voices, a respect I had not heard in my own home for years. But more than anything, I cherished the silence. Not the heavy silence of betrayal, but the healing silence of freedom. Because there's a difference between being silenced by someone who belittles you and choosing your own quiet to find peace. Each evening, I would sit in the living room, the same living room where he once paced and complained, and I would listen to nothing but the ticking of the clock, and it felt like music to me. I realized that wealth was not only measured in dollars or inheritances, though I had both. It was measured in the ability to live without fear, without constant judgment, and without betrayal looming over your shoulder. And as I settled deeper into this new life, I carried no desire to flaunt my independence, no need to prove to him or to Lisa that I had rebuilt, because they were no longer the center of my story. I was. They were trapped in the choices they made, bound to a union built on lies, while I was free, living honestly, carrying dignity they could never steal. That freedom, that calm, that quiet reclaiming of my life was worth more than anything he had promised me during all our years together, and in that truth I finally found myself whole. In time, the whispers began to reach me, quiet murmurs carried by neighbors and acquaintances who thought I would be interested to know how my former husband and Lisa were faring, and though I never asked, the stories found their way to me all the same. At first it was little things, arguments overheard in public, moments where their smiles faltered when they thought no one was watching. But soon the cracks widened into something impossible to hide. People spoke of shouting behind closed doors, of money troubles that seemed to weigh heavily on them, and of Lisa, looking less like the radiant bride she had once been, and more like a woman realizing she had chosen a man whose pride was far larger than his ability to provide. I never gloated when I heard these things. I never laughed or celebrated. I simply listened in silence, because I knew that life has a way of balancing itself, and betrayal always carries its own price. I pictured him sitting at their table, the same arrogance still painted on his face, but this time without the security he once believed was his, because he had walked away from the woman who had quietly built their comfort and left himself exposed with nothing but empty pride. I imagined Lisa discovering piece by piece that the man she thought had given her an escape was nothing more than a hollow promise. A man who relied on someone else to hold up the walls around him. And I wondered if in those moments she remembered the mornings we shared coffee together, when she pretended to support me while secretly betraying me. Perhaps she thought she had won when she slipped that ring onto her finger, but now she was learning that victories built on betrayal never last. They rot from within until there is nothing left but regret. And while their marriage began to crumble, I found myself smiling softly at the thought that I had not needed to lift a finger, not needed to shout or expose them, because everything they had done had already set their downfall in motion. My revenge had never been in schemes or loud confrontations. It was in the quiet patience of waiting, in letting the truth reveal itself at the right time, and in holding on to my dignity while they lost theirs. Each day that passed, I felt lighter, more certain that peace does not come from seeing others suffer, but from knowing that you chose strength when they chose betrayal. So I carried on with my days, steady and calm, letting the world whisper what it would about them, while I focused on the life I had built with my own hands. Their misery was not my joy, but it was my reminder, a reminder that silence can be sharper than anger, that dignity can cut deeper than any revenge, and that true justice is often quiet. And in that quiet I lived freely, knowing that the best lesson he ever learned was not through my words, but through the look on his face, the moment he realized he had lost everything that truly mattered. And now when I look back, I no longer see myself as the woman he once tried to paint with words like lazy and worthless. I see a woman who carried her own strength in silence, who endured betrayal from both a husband and a friend, and who still rose with dignity, intact. Life taught me that revenge does not always need shouting. Sometimes it is enough to let patience reveal the truth, because in the end, he and Lisa were left with regret while I was left with peace. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of my story. It means so much to share this with you. And if my journey touched your heart, please subscribe and share your own story in the comments. I will be here listening.